In this video, I want to talk about something that I think is very important, as I do hopefully with most of my videos on this channel. And that is, how much of our suffering do we contribute to or create? There are certain things in life that we cannot control, and there's a certain amount of suffering in our lives that's unavoidable. Things like physical pain, loss, failure, disappointment, betrayal. These things we have no real power over avoiding. It's inevitable that at some point in time, these things are going to happen to us, and it's our reaction to these things that will determine the larger impact that they have on us. Stoicism instructs us to focus on what we can control, because it is an unwise and futile use of our valuable and limited resources to invest them into things that we have no power over changing. And so, this part of suffering, we should just focus on responding to as best as we can, the kind of suffering that we can't avoid. But there is a kind of suffering that we can avoid, and that we contribute to, whether we know it or not. Now, this is illustrated very powerfully in the parable of the two arrows, which is a story that is told by the Buddha to illustrate this teaching. Now, humans for years, for probably ever since communication arose between us, especially in written form, even in spoken form, would tell each other stories, because stories are a powerful and easy way to distill meaning and lessons in a way that is understandable and memorable. So they're so deeply woven into our very culture that, the Bible is the biggest selling ever book, right? The most popular book that there has ever been, and arguably the most important book that there has ever been. And what is it other than a collection of stories? It's a mini library. And so I don't want you to be naive to these stories and think that they're just outdated or they're just false or there's nothing worth mining within them. There's nothing worth exploring. Because that used to be me. But what I've learned from studying religion is that there is so much to be learned. There is so much wisdom embedded within them, whether the stories are real or not. The meaning within them is real. Certainly. And so now let's get into the story of the two arrows, the parable of the two arrows. So give me a bit of patience while I break this down, because I'm not too well acquainted with the story, but I'm going to tell it to you as best as I can, and hopefully we'll be able to take some valuable wisdom away from it. Hopefully. So imagine that an arrow strikes you, right? It could be in any part of the body. Now I want you to think of this arrow metaphorically. So this is the kind of suffering that we can't avoid, the kind of suffering that I talked about first in this video. So this could represent physical pain, loss, injury, disappointment, failure, certain things that we can't avoid, certain sufferings that are inherent parts of life. But then there is a second arrow that strikes us after that. And obviously the first one is going to cause some amount of pain and suffering. But there is a second one that we inflict upon ourselves in the very same spot that arrow struck us, the first arrow. And this second arrow is defined as our response to the first arrow. It's negative thoughts, it's judgments, it's perceptions, things that we do have control over. So think about it like this. Something bad happens to you, right? You get an injury, for example, and then your thoughts about that injury are like, why me? Why did this have to happen to me? Why did God send this down on me? Why is the universe doing me like this? I don't deserve this. This is unfair. All of these judgments, all of these negative thoughts, they make it worse. They make the suffering more than it would be if you were just looking at it objectively for what it is. And so that's what's represented by the second arrow. But the second arrow is avoidable. The first arrow isn't. The second one is. And the second one hurts more, the Buddha says, because if you imagine, it's hitting the exact same point as the first arrow. But it's also being inflicted by ourselves. And so I want you to think about areas in your life where you might be contributing to your own suffering, where you might be making things worse than they need to be. You know, there might be a certain amount of suffering that you can't avoid in life, and there definitely is, whether you're going through it now or whether you will go through it at some point, or whether you've been through it at the past. There's always suffering. Suffering is a part of life. It's a necessary price we have to pay for existing, I guess. But if you don't have a meaning to offset that suffering, then you're just suffering mindlessly, and it's going to be a lot more painful. And also, how you react to your suffering can either make it worse or it can make it better. You know, Marcus Aurelius described Stoic philosophy and his philosophy itself as like a soothing ointment that you'd put on a blister or a cut. And that's a beautifully poetic way to analogize the benefits that philosophy can have on us. When we're able to philosophize our experience and our suffering and notice that, hey, this isn't happening to me for any specific reason or fault of myself, that I can be held responsible for this suffering that I can't avoid. It's just part of life. It may be unfortunate that it's happened, but it's happened, and I have to deal with it. And if I'm going to deal with it the best way I possibly can and not make things worse for myself or others, I'm going to bear this burden. And I'm not going to complain about it, because what is that going to do? If I can endure it, I'm going to endure it. And that attitude is the soothing ointment that we would put on that strike that we have received by the first arrow, rather than cutting it even deeper, as we often do, mindlessly. And so when you are suffering, next time you are suffering, think to yourself, to what extent is this outside of my control? To what extent may I be possibly making things worse than they need to be? Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.